In my last video, I talked about the initial setup of the box component Prime 9 group set. An amazing 9-speed group set with a super wide range, 11 to 50 in the back. That's just enormous. But also in the previous video, I noted a couple of problems. Most notably, when setting it up friction shifting, the derailleur was just a little bit too stiff and it made it kind of an unpleasant experience to shift it. So fast forward a week later, and I have literally tried every shifter I have right now in the Cave of Bad Ideas with the box components Prime 9 group set. And this is what I think. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers. And if you're new to the channel, if you're into the non-competitive side of cycling, the supple life, you have found your people, hit that subscribe button. And hey, if you guys appreciate the content on this channel, consider joining us on Patreon. You get lots of cool perks, including up to 20 to 25% off of really awesome brands, as well as the opportunity to join us on Zoom calls when we do live streams. So if you've got a bike nerdy question, you can ask our guests directly, which I think is a pretty cool perk. So sometimes I think you can have hopes and dreams about how a product will perform, and then all of a sudden it clashes with reality. And to some extent, that's kind of my feeling on these box component Prime 9 group set. I had this dream, this expectation that I could build the ultimate wide range, absolutely bomb-proof drivetrain that would be awesome for bike touring, bike packing, and gravel. And it's been mostly like that, but there also have been some challenges and some realizations in the process of setting up this drivetrain on my crust bike. So in the previous video, I set up the drivetrain with both Gevinol shifters as well as Paul Thummies, both in friction mode, and the end result was, yes, it would shift, but it was really, really stiff. Especially when using the Gevinol shifters, having your hand in this position and having to apply that much force was just kind of painful. By the end of an hour ride, my forearm was totally sore. It was mitigated a little bit more by the Paul Thummies. I definitely got more leverage when I was pushing against the shifter and the derailleur with my thumb, but still it was really on the stiff side. Since that video, I have tried other things. I have tried a Barcon setup. So setting that up in friction with the hope that the hand position of a Barcon would allow more leverage. And while it's true, it is a little bit more advantageous in terms of a leverage standpoint, it didn't really help the shifting all that much, because when you push down into it, which is the strongest position, you're actually working with the derailleur spring into the harder gear. And most of the resistance I was feeling would have been in this upward position. So the Barcon, great in theory, but in practice, no easier than the other things I've tried. Another thing people have suggested is, of course, down tube shifters. Unfortunately, the crust bike doesn't have the mount so I can put on down tube shifters. But even if it did, it would be the same problem. Moving into the higher gears wouldn't be a problem, but I would still have to pull up with a lot of force to get it into the lower gears. So my experience so far in any kind of friction setup using the box 2 9-speed rear derailleur, it's just going to be hard to shift if you do it in friction. This thinking, of course, then led me to explore another possible hack. So if the derailleur was a problem, what if I swapped out the derailleur to a derailleur with as much capacity to take up 50 teeth, but wouldn't require as much force? So I swapped out the box derailleur and put on a SRAM NX rear derailleur. It was designed for 11 to 12 speed, but had the capacity for a 50-tooth cassette. And in my previous experience, it shifted pretty well with friction. So I put that on, ran a 9-speed chain through it, and surprisingly, it worked. So what I learned in the process is the inner gap of chains, be it 8, 9, 10, 11, they're all essentially the same. What does change is the outer plate thickness. So that's where things can get kind of tricky. I found that the chain made it no problem on the pulley wheels, but the clearances with the derailleur cage were really, really tight. Any kind of sideways deflection could potentially push that 9-speed chain into the derailleur cage. That said, I did take it on a ride and didn't have any excessive rubbing, and it shifted beautifully in friction. So just to reiterate, I was using a 9-speed chain on a 11-speed derailleur on a 9-speed cassette that was 11 to 50. I actually think I would feel pretty comfortable riding it personally, although I don't think I can recommend it to you guys, because depending on what wide capacity 12 speed derailleur you may use, you might run into problems with 9-speed chain rub on the derailleur cage. So I would file this under it works, but wouldn't recommend. And finally, the last thing I tried was I ordered the Dropbar Conversion clamp so I could run the box 2 button shifter and use it with the rear derailleur. So what the clamp essentially does is it replaces the pre-existing clamp with a diameter for mountain bike bars, and it allows it to clamp on a drop bar handlebar near the stem. So I know you can do this with other drivetrains. I'm generally not a fan of it just because I prefer the shifting a little bit closer to the hood. But what could I do? It was finally my last option to try to make this work on the crust. So the mounting was pretty straightforward and just as you would expect. One click, one shift. However, the problem I did have still is the amount of force it took to push the paddle to initiate a shift. It was a lot more, in my experience, than with any Shimano setup or with any SRAM setup. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. It could be I have a derailleur that's adjusted too tightly, or somehow I did the cabling wrong and it's causing some excess friction. Any number of things. But the point being, in my experience so far, is that it just takes a lot of force. Yes, the shifting works, but I feel like I have to do the equivalent of a thumb push-up to move it into a lower gear. But shifting force aside, let's assume that it just worked perfectly and it was light and crisp and all those kind of buzzwords. What I did realize taking the crust bikes on with this setup is that for me, I think at the end of the day, I was really hopeful that 9 speeds would be enough with this mega range. But I actually kind of found that while doable and fun in kind of a punk rock kind of way, it wasn't the most pleasurable riding experience. So let me explain. While the range is there, definitely high enough to go fast and low enough to go up some really steep gravel climbs, I did find that the nature of the roads I was riding, where there are kind of sustained climbs and varying grades, I could never really sink into my preferred cadence. I always found myself spinning a little bit too fast or pushing a little bit harder. I thought that I could adapt, but in practice, it was more annoying than anything. So I think ultimately for me, I don't think I'm gonna leave it on a gravel bike. I think I'll probably migrate it to the Jones bike, where I think it's a more appropriate use, where there's lots of varying terrain that changes really quickly. I can see that's where it makes more sense. And of course it was developed initially with mountain biking in mind. So not necessarily gravel riding. This was just a bit of a stretch and a bit of an experiment. But before I move it to the Jones, I think I will try one more test. One of our dear Patreon community members is sending over some old Ultegra 9-speed shifters. And just for the sake of internet knowledge, I will see if 9-speed Shimano drifters do indeed work or not work, or to what extent they work with the box components Prime 9 rear derailleur. So while this whole process was a bit of a mixed bag, I didn't get the 9-speed ultra wide range apocalypse proof drivetrain of my dreams, it was still a pretty fun exercise. And once again, just because it didn't work for me, doesn't mean it won't work for you. You might be completely okay with the big jump. It might be that I have a rear derailleur just that is abnormally stiff and that you might have a better experience. So just keep that in mind. If you guys have any other questions about all the things I've tried, leave those in the comments below. Be sure to check out other bike shifter hacks in our Cave of Bad Ideas playlist. And if you like this video and want to see more, consider supporting us on Patreon, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and keep the supple side down.